Welcome to Conspiracy Files with Zoe Parker. I'm your host, Zoe Parker, and in today's episode, we uncover one of the most unsettling and controversial government programs in modern history. A secret operation buried for decades behind closed doors and classified documents, mind control, psychological warfare, and experiments on unsuspecting citizens. This is the story of MKUltra and the fight for your freedom. In the years following the end of the Second World War, the United States government became deeply invested in understanding and countering the psychological tactics used by enemy regimes. The rise of communism across Eastern Europe and Asia intensified fears that foreign powers had developed mind control techniques capable of manipulating individuals and undermining national security. In particular, reports from Korea and China raised concerns about prisoners of war who returned home appearing mentally altered, expressing sympathies for enemy ideologies, and, in some cases, denouncing their own governments. These events planted a seed of panic within American intelligence agencies. What if the mind could be broken? Worse, what if it could be rebuilt? This fear became a driving force behind the creation of a covert project under the Central Intelligence Agency. In the early 1950s, a program known as MKUltra was officially born. Its mission was not defensive. It was not simply about learning what foreign powers could do. It was about going further. It was about control. The kind of control that could reach inside the human mind, manipulate behavior, alter memory, suppress free will, and engineer loyalty. The program took shape under the direction of a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, who would become the architect of some of the most disturbing experiments ever carried out by the United States government. Under Gottlieb's leadership, the agency sought to develop tools for interrogation, psychological conditioning, and behavior modification. They believed that the key to unlocking the mind lay in chemicals, substances that could disorient, confuse, or break a subject's resistance entirely. Lethal poisons, hallucinogens, sensory deprivation, and hypnosis were all studied in various combinations. The Central Intelligence Agency did not limit these tests to laboratories or willing participants. Many experiments were conducted without informed consent. In hospitals, prisons, mental institutions, and universities, unsuspecting individuals were given powerful drugs and subjected to trauma, sometimes repeatedly. The logic was simple. Break a mind to study how it could be rebuilt. The ethics, or lack thereof, were another matter entirely. As the Cold War intensified, so did the paranoia. The idea that a single agent could be turned against their own country, or that an enemy could be made to confess under invisible pressure, was seen as a strategic imperative. MKUltra operated under deep secrecy, bypassing congressional oversight and hiding behind layers of code names and shell operations. Even within the intelligence community, few people knew the full extent of what was being done or why. The political and cultural atmosphere of the 1950s helped shield the program from scrutiny. In an era where patriotism and fear of communism often overrode civil liberties, the idea of sacrificing a few for the protection of many was quietly accepted, even expected. But the cost of these experiments would only become clear decades later, when pieces of the puzzle finally began to surface. As the program expanded through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, it drew in a web of institutions, individuals, and cover operations, many of which were never aware they were part of a larger scheme. Universities were one of the most effective fronts. Through grant programs and shell organizations, the Central Intelligence Agency funneled money into research on behavior modification, psychopharmacology, and hypnosis, all under the guise of academic inquiry. Professors, graduate students, and clinical researchers unknowingly became agents of a program designed to weaponize the human mind. At the heart of MKUltra was the belief that psychedelic substances could unravel the psyche and expose the deepest layers of consciousness. Lysergic acid diethylamide, known more commonly as LSD, became a central focus of experimentation. First synthesized in 1938 and rediscovered in the 1940s by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, LSD was still largely unknown to the public. But within the walls of MKUltra, it was treated as a potential miracle drug, one that could either unlock the secrets of the soul or reduce a person to a blank slate. Under Sidney Gottlieb's direction, agents dosed prisoners, hospital patients, and even their own colleagues. One of the most infamous cases was that of Dr. Frank Olson, a biological warfare scientist working within the Department of Defense. In November of 1953, Olson was given LSD without his knowledge during a retreat organized by the Central Intelligence Agency. Days later, he reportedly plunged to his death from a 13th floor window of a New York City hotel. His death was ruled a suicide. But decades later, evidence and testimony from family members raised serious doubts about whether he had been driven to jump or pushed to his death to silence what he had learned. Another key figure in the program was George White, a Federal Narcotics Bureau agent who conducted a series of MKUltra experiments under a sub-project known as Operation Midnight Climax. In safe houses located in San Francisco and New York, White oversaw a series of bizarre and disturbing tests. Prostitutes, secretly employed by the agency, lured unsuspecting men into rooms where they were dosed with LSD and observed through two-way mirrors. The purpose was to study sexual behavior and susceptibility under the influence of psychoactive substances. White later wrote in a letter, half joking, half boasting, that he worked for the devil himself. Many of the doctors and researchers involved operated under strict compartmentalization. Most were told only what they needed to know. Some believed they were working on medical breakthroughs. Others likely understood the darker implications but chose not to ask questions. Funding came through foundations with benign names, and paperwork was often destroyed once results were filed. This structure allowed MKUltra to thrive in the shadows, unchallenged and largely undocumented, a ghost network fueled by paranoia and cloaked in patriotism. Even as concerns occasionally surfaced inside the agency, they were quickly buried. In a culture where secrecy and loyalty were paramount, whistleblowing was nearly impossible. The few who did question the ethics or legality of the work were removed, reassigned, or ignored. And so the experiments continued, often escalating in cruelty and ambition, all in the name of control. By the early 1960s, MKUltra had expanded into more than 150 documented subprojects, each with a different focus, methodology, or target population. Though the full extent may never be known due to intentional destruction of records, the surviving fragments reveal a chilling array of techniques and ambitions. One of the most heavily explored areas was the potential use of drugs to erase memory, alter personality, and implant new behavior. Not just through chemicals, but through conditioning. Hypnosis was studied extensively, with researchers attempting to determine whether it could be used to induce amnesia, create new identities, or even compel subjects to perform actions against their will. Some experiments tested whether individuals under hypnosis could carry out complex missions or commit acts of violence without conscious awareness. While results were often inconsistent or inconclusive, the mere pursuit of such outcomes reveals the mindset of the project's architects. Sensory deprivation was another widely tested method. Volunteers and prisoners alike were placed in isolation chambers for hours, sometimes days. These chambers were completely dark and silent, cutting off the brain's access to external stimuli. Subjects often reported hallucinations, dissociation, and deep psychological distress. The goal was to explore whether breaking the sensory connection to the outside world could create a more malleable mind, one that might then accept new beliefs or directives more easily. In some cases, electroconvulsive therapy was combined with drug treatment, producing a potent and terrifying blend of memory loss, confusion, and emotional destabilization. One such facility involved in these experiments was the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada. Under the direction of psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron, patients were subjected to what he called depatterning. The process involved high doses of psychoactive drugs, extended periods of induced sleep, and repeated auditory messages played over loudspeakers for days or even weeks. These patients were not told they were part of a Central Intelligence Agency-backed project. They had simply come for help. Children were not exempt from experimentation. At various points, MKUltra subprojects explored the effects of trauma, separation, and stress on young minds. Foster homes, orphanages, and reform schools were among the institutions that researchers viewed as convenient and controllable environments. Because many of these populations had little access to legal recourse or media attention, they became targets for high-risk trials with no informed consent. The surviving documentation makes clear that at no point were the long-term effects of these treatments truly understood, nor were they the primary concern. What mattered to the agency was what could be done in the short term. Could a person's loyalty be erased? Could a false memory be implanted? Could an enemy agent be made to defect, or better yet, return home as an unwitting weapon? The notion of the human mind as a battlefield was no longer metaphor. It was a mission objective. A new kind of war was being waged, not on the ground or in the skies, but inside the very consciousness of individuals. In this context, the ethical boundaries of science and national security began to blur, and for many involved, the line between protecting freedom and dismantling it was quietly erased. As details about MKUltra slowly emerged over the decades, researchers, journalists, and surviving victims began piecing together what little documentation remained. Much of the core evidence was destroyed in 1973 under orders from Richard Helms, then director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Fearing political fallout or future legal repercussions, Helms instructed that all MKUltra files be eliminated. However, a trove of budgetary and administrative documents was missed during the purge. These forgotten records would later become the foundation for congressional investigations and independent exposés. Among the documents that survived were payment receipts, sub-project summaries, and correspondence between front organizations and the agency. While they did not include specific experiment results or participant identities, they provided a roadmap of the program's scale and reach. Combined with personal testimonies and court proceedings, a chilling picture began to emerge. Evidence pointed to the deliberate use of deception, coercion, and psychological manipulation on hundreds, possibly thousands, of individuals across North America and beyond. One of the most powerful cases came from a Canadian woman named Linda MacDonald, who was treated at the Allen Memorial Institute in the 1960s. She had sought help for mild depression and anxiety. Instead, she was placed in a treatment protocol involving multiple rounds of electroshock therapy, heavy sedatives, and what was called psychic driving, the repeated playing of taped messages intended to overwrite thought patterns. When she was finally released, Linda had lost all memory of her adult life, including her husband and children. Years later, she would testify that she had been reduced to the mental state of a small child. Her story echoed that of many others whose lives were permanently altered in the name of national defense. Another important source of insight was the Church Committee, a congressional investigation launched in 1975 to examine abuses by the Central Intelligence Agency and other intelligence agencies. Led by Senator Frank Church, the committee brought MKUltra into the public eye for the first time. Witnesses described covert drug testing, illegal surveillance, and disregard for basic human rights. One former agent testified that the program had operated with near total impunity, with no meaningful oversight from elected officials or the judicial system. The committee's findings, while significant, were limited by the destruction of records and the refusal of many involved to testify. Still, they confirmed the existence of a vast secret project that had targeted both foreign enemies and American citizens. In its final report, the Church Committee concluded that MKUltra represented a fundamental violation of the Constitution and of basic human dignity. Yet no criminal charges were ever brought against those responsible. No public apology was issued. And for many victims, justice remained entirely out of reach. In the years since, declassified documents and independent investigations have continued to surface. Some researchers have identified additional institutions and individuals connected to the program, while others have speculated about ongoing covert experimentation under new code names. The lack of accountability and transparency has only deepened suspicions that MKUltra was not an isolated chapter in American history, but the beginning of a new era of invisible warfare, one in which the mind itself became a weapon and truth was buried beneath layers of secrecy. In the wake of public exposure, MKUltra became one of the most scrutinized and controversial intelligence programs ever revealed. Yet as awareness spread, so did skepticism. Journalists, academics, and government officials began to question the narrative, not to refute its existence, but to probe its true impact. Some argued that the results of the program were overblown, that the science behind mind control was fundamentally flawed, and that no reliable technique was ever developed for erasing or rewriting a person's will. Others suggested that the chaos and lack of structure within MKUltra made it more of a reckless experiment than a systematic assault on consciousness. Several researchers pointed to the limited success of hypnosis and drug-induced behavior changes. While certain cases documented temporary dissociation or confusion, there was little proof that the program ever achieved its most ambitious goals, such as programming assassins, creating amnesia on command, or controlling a subject's behavior with total precision. Critics emphasized the lack of peer-reviewed data, the absence of consistent methodology, and the ethically compromised nature of the studies themselves. In their view, MKUltra was a tale of dangerous ambition, not successful engineering. However, survivors and whistleblowers offered a different perspective. For them, the damage was undeniable. Emotional trauma, shattered families, and permanent memory loss were not theoretical side effects. They were lived realities. Lawsuits filed by victims attempted to hold the United States government accountable, but few ever saw meaningful compensation. The argument that the program had failed in its goals provided little comfort to those who suffered its consequences. From their viewpoint, whether the experiment succeeded scientifically was irrelevant. The intent had been clear, and the outcomes irreversible. Within the intelligence community, the legacy of MKUltra remained ambiguous. Some officials distanced themselves from the program entirely, describing it as a relic of a more paranoid era. Others defended it, insisting that it had been a necessary response to a perceived existential threat during the Cold War. The justification echoed a familiar theme: national security above all else. But the ethical cost of that justification continued to haunt every discussion surrounding the program. Independent researchers and conspiracy theorists added yet another layer to the discourse. Some believed that MKUltra had never truly ended, but had instead evolved into new forms under different names. They pointed to suspicious research grants, secret facilities, and classified projects that appeared to continue exploring the boundaries of psychological manipulation. Whether these claims were rooted in fact or fueled by fear, they reflected a broader public distrust of institutional secrecy. At the heart of the skepticism was a simple but profound question: how much power should any government have over the human mind? While critics attempted to downplay the scientific outcomes of MKUltra, the deeper concern was philosophical. The idea that a government agency would even attempt to override free will, regardless of whether it succeeded, was enough to unsettle the public. And as new technologies emerged in the 21st century, including artificial intelligence, brain-machine interfaces, and digital surveillance, the legacy of MKUltra became more relevant, not less. Skeptics and believers alike found common ground in this concern. If the mind could be influenced, even subtly, what protections existed to prevent it from being exploited? Where did scientific exploration end and psychological warfare begin? And if MKUltra was the known chapter, what remains hidden? These questions have no easy answers, and perhaps that is exactly why they continue to echo. The deeper implications of MKUltra reach far beyond the confines of classified documents or Cold War paranoia. At its core, the program represented a radical shift in how power could be exerted, not through weapons or territory, but through the architecture of the human mind. It redefined warfare itself, suggesting that influence, obedience, and even identity could be engineered through psychological tools. In this context, MKUltra did not merely test chemicals or techniques. It questioned the very foundation of what it means to be free. The political implications were staggering. If the government could secretly experiment on its own citizens under the justification of national security, where were the limits? What other policies, programs, or institutions might operate under similar logic? The exposure of MKUltra ignited broader debates about transparency, civil liberties, and the reach of executive power. It laid bare the structural mechanisms that allowed such a program to exist: layers of classification, absence of oversight, and a culture that prized obedience over accountability. Psychologically, the ripple effects were no less profound. Survivors who had been subjected to forced drugging, isolation, and trauma carried those scars for life. Some were institutionalized. Others were discredited or silenced. The damage done was not just physical, but existential. Memories were stolen. Personal identities were fragmented. Trust in medical institutions and mental health professionals was eroded, particularly among marginalized communities that had already been vulnerable to systemic abuse. Culturally, MKUltra entered the bloodstream of American consciousness in subtle and overt ways. Films, books, and television shows began to reflect themes of mind control, amnesia, and hidden manipulation. Stories about secret agents and brainwashed assassins no longer felt like pure fiction. Popular culture absorbed the echoes of MKUltra and transformed them into modern myth: the shadowy agent with a scrambled past, the sleeper operative activated by a code word, the institutional betrayal wrapped in a patriotic flag. These were not just plot devices. They were allegories of real fears. Even the language of control evolved. Phrases like psychological operations, behavioral engineering, and information warfare entered the public lexicon. The tools used in MKUltra, from repeated messaging to emotional disorientation, found resonance in advertising, propaganda, and even social media algorithms. The line between experimentation and application grew thinner with each passing decade. For many, the most disturbing implication of MKUltra was not what it achieved, but what it revealed. It showed that the human mind was not sacred in the eyes of power, that identity, memory, and consent could be violated without recourse, that ethics could be suspended under the banner of security. These were not abstract revelations. They were historical facts. The program also forced a national reckoning with the question of who holds authority over the individual. Is the state the ultimate guardian of well-being, or can it become the architect of suffering when left unchecked? The balance between protection and control has never been simple, but MKUltra made that tension visible in ways that could never be forgotten. As new generations confront issues of surveillance, privacy, and psychological influence, the legacy of MKUltra continues to loom. It serves as both a warning and a blueprint, a reminder that the tools of freedom and control often come from the same toolbox, and that once opened, the human mind is not easily closed again. As media narratives evolved, MKUltra began to appear not just in investigative reports, but in movies, novels, music, and political commentary. It became a cultural shorthand for the idea that institutions could not be trusted, that behind every official explanation, there might be another layer hidden from view. This growing awareness fueled a deep and persistent skepticism toward power. In the decades following MKUltra's exposure, public trust in government institutions began to erode. Scandals like Watergate, Iran-Contra, and covert surveillance programs only reinforced the idea that secrecy and control were not exceptions, but patterns. MKUltra became a symbol, not just of scientific overreach, but of a government willing to sacrifice its own people in the pursuit of unseen objectives. In the media, the concept of mind control shifted from fringe theory to mainstream metaphor. Films like The Manchurian Candidate, Jacob's Ladder, and later, The Bourne Identity all drew on themes rooted in MKUltra: memory loss, psychological conditioning, and covert experimentation. These stories echoed the fear that identity itself could be rewritten, that truth could be engineered, and that free will might be nothing more than a programmed illusion. They also mirrored growing concerns about the role of media in shaping perception. As journalism evolved into a 24-hour news cycle and social media emerged as a primary source of information, the question of influence became more relevant than ever. Algorithms began to predict, shape, and reinforce human behavior in ways that echoed the goals of MKUltra, without chemicals, wires, or confinement. The shift was subtle but powerful. Instead of being strapped to a table in a government lab, individuals voluntarily gave away data, attention, and emotion to platforms designed to learn from and manipulate their choices. This digital evolution of psychological influence raised difficult questions. If MKUltra had been condemned for violating consent, what do we make of a society where consent is buried in unread terms and conditions? If memory and identity were once targeted with drugs, what happens when they are shaped by curated feeds and behavioral nudges? In this new world, the tools are different, but the outcomes may be strikingly similar. Some theorists argue that modern media and digital technology have become the new battleground for consciousness. Attention is the currency. Control of narrative is the weapon. In this environment, MKUltra is not just history. It is a reference point for understanding how influence can operate invisibly, but effectively. The idea that perception can be shaped, beliefs implanted, and behavior altered through repetition and suggestion now feels less like a theory and more like a daily reality. Even government programs that emerged in the 21st century, focused on domestic surveillance, social engineering, and data profiling, have drawn comparisons to the psychological experimentation of the past. Though few bear the same dramatic labels or overt secrecy, their goals often echo the same principle: understanding how people think and finding ways to guide them without their full awareness. In this sense, MKUltra was not merely a closed chapter of Cold War history. It became a blueprint, or perhaps a cautionary tale, about how institutions seek control, how science can be weaponized, and how the human mind remains both the most sacred and most vulnerable frontier. Beyond the verified documents and confirmed subprojects, MKUltra has also given rise to a wide constellation of fringe theories, speculative claims, and underground testimonies. These more controversial elements are often dismissed by mainstream historians, but they continue to resonate deeply within alternative research communities. In these circles, MKUltra is not simply a past operation. It is seen as a living system, adapted, renamed, and still operating under different forms and facades. One of the most persistent claims is that MKUltra did not end in the 1970s, but was instead absorbed into new programs with broader digital and technological reach. Names like Monarch and Artichoke are often cited, unofficially, as continuations or evolutions of the same foundational experiments in mind control, trauma-based conditioning, and dissociative identity programming. While no definitive documentation has confirmed the existence of these programs, the themes they explore are consistent: the use of fear, isolation, and suggestion to fracture consciousness and build new psychological structures inside the human mind. Perhaps the most controversial subset of these theories involves the idea of programmed individuals, people trained from a young age through trauma, drugs, and suggestion to operate as unwitting assets, couriers, or agents. These individuals, it is claimed, are often unaware of their programming and may live normal lives until activated by a keyword, sound, or symbol. Survivors who claim to have escaped such programs often report fragmented memories, recurring nightmares, and inexplicable gaps in time. While their stories are difficult to verify, they often include recurring patterns, elite connections, ritualistic abuse, and handlers embedded within institutions. Other fringe theories suggest that MKUltra was part of a much larger occult framework, a secret fusion of intelligence science and ancient esoteric belief systems. According to these ideas, mind control was not just about interrogation or espionage. It was about accessing hidden layers of consciousness, tapping into what some call the collective unconscious, and reshaping reality at a symbolic and psychological level. In this view, MKUltra was both a political tool and a spiritual experiment, a gateway between control and creation. Some researchers have even pointed to patterns in pop culture and public events as signs of continued programming. Symbolism in music videos, award shows, and political rituals is often cited as evidence of mass psychological conditioning, with themes of duality, dissociation, and hidden messages appearing repeatedly. Whether these are intentional signals or the projection of pattern-seeking minds remains debated, but the belief that programming extends beyond individuals and into the mass psyche is a key pillar of this fringe perspective. In this speculative space, MKUltra becomes something more than a historical event. It becomes a lens through which the entire modern world is examined. Education, media, medicine, government. Everything is potentially suspect. Everything is possibly connected. This belief does not rely on concrete evidence as much as on patterns, symbols, and emotional resonance. It is not about proving what happened. It is about understanding how systems of power can shape perception itself. Critics of these theories argue that such thinking leads to paranoia, disinformation, and the erosion of trust in legitimate institutions. But to those who believe they have lived through hidden programs or seen the shadows firsthand, skepticism of the official story is not irrational. It is survival. For them, the absence of proof is not evidence of fantasy. It is exactly what a successful operation would look like: hidden, denied, and quietly maintained in plain sight. The story of MKUltra is not just a chapter in the history of intelligence. It is a mirror reflecting the hidden desires and fears of those who hold power. It revealed how fragile the boundary is between scientific inquiry and moral transgression, between protection and exploitation, between freedom and control. The program itself may have ended in the early 1970s, but its legacy remains woven into our collective consciousness. In the stories we tell, the institutions we question, and the technologies we increasingly depend on. What makes MKUltra especially haunting is that it operated not on the battlefield, but in hospitals, universities, and quiet offices across North America. It did not rely on bombs or tanks, but on words, sounds, chemicals, and ideas. Its subjects were not always foreign enemies or captured spies, but ordinary people, students, patients, prisoners, often unaware they were even part of an experiment. In some cases, they trusted the very people who were assigned to break them down. The deeper questions raised by MKUltra continue to echo today. What does it mean to consent? How do we protect the sanctity of the human mind in a world where influence has become invisible? Can we ever fully trust institutions that once sought to rewire the very nature of identity? In the age of artificial intelligence, brain-computer interfaces, algorithmic persuasion, and predictive behavior modeling, the spirit of MKUltra feels increasingly relevant. The tools may have changed, but the intentions, to guide, to control, to shape thought without detection, remain disturbingly familiar. We no longer need isolated rooms and chemical compounds to manipulate perception. We have screens, signals, and feedback loops, engineered with precision and deployed at scale. Some will say MKUltra is a warning. Others will say it was only the beginning. But whether one sees it as a rogue operation or part of a broader system of control, its existence can no longer be denied. It is documented, named, confessed, though never truly reconciled. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling part. Because if the human mind can be programmed, fractured, and rebuilt, then so can a society. The question is, who holds the remote? Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Conspiracy Files with Zoe Parker. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show and unlock bonus content, subscribe to the Forbidden Knowledge Network on Patreon. Subscribe now.